First it was Southport, then, in no particular order, it was Hartlepool, London, Manchester, and even Aldershot as well. There is a lot of ungoiled anger and tension out there. Is banning an organisation the way forward? Well, yesterday, the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner was speaking with my LBC colleague Sheila Fogarty after Home Secretary Yvette Cooper suggested the government would look at banning the EDL in light of these events. Angela Rayner was asked if she agreed with that idea.
Well, we would look at the various different groups, but I think the principle has to be we don't have thuggish behaviour in the UK. We have the rule of law. Now, protest is important. And I absolutely believe in the right to people to protest.
However horrible someone's opinion might be.
Absolutely. Like I say, I've debated Nigel in the past. But the inciting of violence and violence on the street has absolutely no place in our democracy. And we have to crack down on those that perpetuate violence and spread it within our communities. First of all, we've got to take them on, which, we've got to say, actually, those views, we know where you're going with this.
There is a lot of anger out there, and comments from leading politicians didn't stop after another night of violence breaking out across England. Here in London, a protest branding itself Enough is Enough. What does that mean? In Downing Street led to more than 100 arrests for various offences. Here's a little of how that played out. And then to other sites such as Newton Heath in Greater Manchester, Aldershot in Hampshire and Hartlepool. There were violent protests, arrests and ugly scenes as well. Here's rioters clashing with the police in Hartlepool. Because nothing solves problems such as the one we face better than setting a police car alight, does it? Back to London, LBC's reporter Helen Hoddenut was on the scene.
Whitehall was closed off with police vans waiting in Trafalgar Square. There were chants of stop the boats as officers close to the group called for backup, eventually creating a barricade across the road. Signs read, "We will not be silenced," and members of the group were warning that, in their words, it's all going to kick off. Some of the group started testing police, making their way out of the designated rally zone a bit further each time. Police officers were being shoved and protesters started pushing against railings, but stayed for the most part in a standoff situation. One of the men speaking to the crowd with a microphone claimed that the protest was about knife crime. He said it's out of control, citing Southport and the Southend machete attacks this week. Officers put on riot gear as demonstrators surrounded the cenotaph before bottles and cans started being thrown at police.
Helen Hoddenot reporting for LBC 9 after 7. First, let's go to Nick Aldworth, who was a Detective Chief Superintendent with the Met and former National Counter-Terrorism Coordinator. And it's very much with that hat on, as it were. I put my first question to you. Nick, thanks for coming on the show. What can you tell us about the EDL? Morning to you.
Good morning. So the EDL is quite a confused organisation that has its roots back as far as the early 2000s. It reportedly grew out of the British National Party. If people remember that awful organisation. And one of the things about the EDL is they're quite confused in what their ideology is and what they want. They will argue that they are a non-political organisation who are just standing up for English rights. They will argue they are not extreme right. Sociologists actually find it quite hard to say what they are. And I think that sits at the heart of how you then start to progress them through legal channels.
So here's the thing, Nick. I asked one of my colleagues, what exactly do EDL stand for? What do they want? There's no website. There's no list of demands. There's no manifesto, as it were, as you've very accurately described it. It's a rather disparate band. So how would you ban such a disparate band?
So I think under current legislation, you can't. It's as simple as that. To be proscribed, you have to be supporting, committing, encouraging, promoting terrorist acts. And what I see is just blatant thuggery on the streets that sometimes becomes violent, sometimes it doesn't. And therefore, that doesn't really fit the definition of terrorism, which is the only route through that you have for prescription.
Well, it's not that long ago you'd have been at the Yard, as National Counter-Terrorism Coordinator. Had you been called in, how do you see it, Nick? How do you see it developing, and what needs to be done by the police?
Yeah, so that's the route forward we've got to try and find, Nick. So to start with, the police are really effective at using their public order powers to ban and control these marches.
Yeah.
They do it all the time in London. We've seen flashpoints in London. I'm not saying it doesn't, it fully stops violence, but it certainly does a lot to contain these people. So that's the first route. That's the current legal route that we have to manage these people. I do think there's a discussion to be had in Parliament around, if you like, a prescription light on some of these organisations that attract violence rather than necessarily promote violence and terrorism.
Which organisations are those, Nick?
Well, the EDL is very clearly one of them. You know, it's very rare that you come across an EDL march that doesn't result in some form of violence or disruption. But maybe it's something under the Public Order Act that says, here's a list of organisations that we know usually end up in violent protest, and therefore we apply additional measures in whether they're allowed to protest or not.
Lastly, this must be probably one of the biggest headaches there can be for police forces and services up and down the country, because there will be a streak of just about everything here, won't there? There'll be anarchists who want to protest. There'll be people who want to protest about anything, and they see this as the opportunity to throw bricks at police officers and set the cars alight.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. We've seen that time and time again, from the student protests back in 2011, was that, I think?
Yes.
Through to the modern day, where you have a hardcore people who are there because they believe in something, and then you have rent-a-mob arrive around the outside. And some of the footage I've seen from Southport, they're all just piled out the pub. Yeah. Absolutely. It's just a disgrace, isn't it? It's a disgrace.
It is, but it's the blokes and women who serve under you, unfortunately, who are being put in harm's way almost on a nightly basis. Nick Aldworth, thanks. Nick, I've got to go now. You, of course, were National Counter-Terrorism Coordinator. Thanks for your input. 13 after 7. Well, this all comes, excuse me, as Mr Aldworth was saying, this all comes from those terrible events in Southport. Let's go to Councillor Sean Halsall, who's an independent member for the Q ward of Sefton Council. And the councillor grew up on Hart Street, which is, of course, where the Taylor Swift dance class was being held. Thanks for coming on, Councillor. What's your take on the idea of government looking to prescribe, to ban EDL? What impact do you think that would have? Morning to you.
Morning, Nick. First of all, how abhorrent is it that after the deaths of 3 young girls, the far right have managed to take all the attention for themselves when people should be able to grieve and mourn the loss?
Fair point, yeah.
Secondly, on the actual point there, these organisations are very good at changing the names, and there's enough of them for them to pile into other ones. I'm not sure how effective banning organisations would be when this chameleon-like, aren't they? We see a long list of far-right groups in this country. Patriotic Alternative at the moment, who I believe were around as well. The BNP, EDL, Combat 18, the list is endless of these sort of organisations. I think it would be much better if we start addressing people's material needs and don't give the far right that sort of space to...
What do you mean by that, Councillor? When you say their material needs, what does that mean?
Yeah, work that pays, housing, energy bills that are affordable, food that's affordable. I think...
Do you think a lot of people out there who are angry for some of the reasons, they've latched onto this, so they might not be members of Patriotic Alternative, they're just angry about housing or no work, and they see this as an opportunity to vent their anger, Councillor?
I think people get drawn into that far-right narrative and far-right messaging when they don't know who to blame, and then people like Tommy Robinson then fill that void. This is something that happens every time the far-right rises throughout history. It's because of deprivation. You see the Great Depression in the forefront to what was going on.
Councillor, I'll leave you to your work working with the good folk of Southport and, of course, bringing some comfort to them.